Firstly, I'm not going to excuse myself because if everybody's speaking in different languages, prahundar, that's Welsh for good afternoon. But I won't do my speech in Welsh because I don't think anybody on the panel will be able to do any translation, so I'll stick to English. I will keep it all relatively short because a lot has been said now about neutrality. A lot has been said about what neutrality means, the different types of neutrality, how things are intertwined. So I'm going to do a little bit more of a focus on the Republic of Moldova, because that's why we're here. When one looks at the risks, the security risks that the Republic is facing nowadays, you can argue that some of them are long-standing. Arguably, the hybrid threat from the Russian Federation has been here since the Declaration of Independence. It maybe has not been as significant or as sophisticated as it is now, but it has always been there. The possibilities of agitation from within the Republic of Moldova have always been there, with the unresolved conflict over the Transnistrian region, with the issues around Gagauzia, which were arguably postponed or resolved by the 1994 law on the autonomy, and obviously the permanent presence of what were at the time the remains of the 14th Army, Russians, which are now the operational group of Russian forces, according to the official ORBAT of the Russian Federation, but now are probably 98% Transnistrian individuals who hold Russian passports and therefore are eligible to join the Russian military. So these threats have already been there for a long, long time. Now, I think obviously the open armed conflict in Ukraine has brought all this to the fore and has started in a lot of discussions on the future of the Republic. Where are we going to go? Where is Moldova going to go? According to the Constitution, Moldova is neutral. But is it? And there are, as Stefan pointed out and others, there are different types of neutrality. What sort of neutrality does Moldova have? What sort of neutrality maybe does Moldova need? Permanent neutrality, Austria, Switzerland, I would say that they were security guarantees at the time, but post February the 24th, 2022, there are no security guarantees left in this world. I would argue that now the neutrality of Austria and Switzerland is based on international recognition and acceptance of their permanent neutral status. So that becomes a form of guarantee, but even that could be under question. The conversations in Moldova now are neutrality or possibly NATO. Why NATO? Well, people look at NATO and say collective security. NATO hasn't been involved in wars, and as was already pointed out to us, I would argue that there are maybe a couple of examples, and I can only think of 4 that I've noted down so far, where NATO potentially has been at war, or arguably maybe even started a war of sorts. If one looks at Libya, 2011, NATO imposed a no-fly zone, but at the same time, NATO attacked government forces. If you look at Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan was ongoing. NATO got involved, arguably because of Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, but they weren't the government. If you look at Kosovo, Kosovo was a low-level insurgency, arguably, and then escalated because NATO threatened to intervene. So, arguably, what is NATO in terms of a security guarantee? Article 5, which is the be-all and end-all of NATO membership, one sovereign state attack, the others have to blah, blah, blah. But if you look at Article 6.1, which defines more of that specificity it's slightly different. Plus, of course, Article 5's only been implemented once in the history of NATO, and that was after the September 11th attacks. When one looks at neutrality, Moldova could be in a unique position, irrespective of the outcome of the armed conflict in Ukraine. As a neutral country with international acceptance and recognition, Moldova could become a focal point of mediation, much like Switzerland and Austria have become. There is that potential. At the moment, I think we find ourselves in a position where internal regional issues, internal political issues, the conflict in Ukraine are impacting on every aspect of life in the Republic of Moldova. And security is coming to the forefront. And that's both hard security and human security. A lovely UN phrase that's slightly undefined, because if I was to ask every single individual in this room what their perception of human security is, it would be different. Everyone has their own opinion of what their human security involves. The debate over neutrality or membership of NATO, it's very much in the public space at the moment. It's very much being influenced by what's going on in Ukraine, but also what's happening internally in Moldova. There are lots of people who believe that NATO is the only option. I would argue that there is also neutrality, and both need to be considered. Changing the neutral status of the Republic of Moldova requires constitutional change, therefore a referendum. But my perspective, my argument is, irrespective of the final outcome in Ukraine, the whole of the European security architecture will change dramatically. Dramatically. It cannot remain the same. No one knows what that will be. Will there be a mini NATO? A macro NATO? Will there be a European defence force that is more than just a paper exercise, as it pretty much has been so far? What about bilateral agreements for collective security? Because arguably, NATO is very big and the United States is a long way away from Europe, and it may well be that depending on the future perspective of the United States, they say, hey Europe, at least in the initial stages, you've got a conflict, you deal with it yourselves, and then we'll invoke Article 5 and bring NATO in per se at a later stage if it escalates, if it's in our political interests. When it comes to the future security of the Republic of Moldova, all the bits that I've said need to be considered. But one thing is clear, that it cannot be decided by individuals or a government. It has to be decided by the people. And that decision has to be based on open, frank, and honest dialogue. Because I can present great arguments for NATO, and I can present great arguments against NATO, and great arguments for neutrality and the different types of neutrality. That needs to be laid out so that people have that honest discussion. It should start now. It should start now, because we can't wait until the armed conflict in Ukraine is over and for a result it's going to be too late. We can't wait until maybe internal provocations in the Republic of Moldova escalate. It'll be too late. It needs to be discussed now. But it all needs to be put on the table for people to have that understanding of what the options are, what the options mean. But it's also incumbent on a national security strategy that envisages where we want Moldova to go. European integration, arguably, is a given. That's not going to cause internal issues. Gagauzia is going to be for it, the Transnistrian region is going to be for it, because it's economic growth and investment and trade. But what's the future perspective? That strategy needs to have an end state of what Moldova requires to ensure its national security, whether it be membership of NATO, whether it be a form of neutrality, whether it be a series of bilateral agreements. But all that needs discussion, and the people need to have that informed discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young.